Thanks so much for coming so early on a Friday morning and for having, it's an honor to be speaking in this space, which is an incredible place here we have in Albuquerque. So when I was considering what I would talk about today, I looked up the definition of the word change in the Oxford Dictionary. I do that a lot these days. As a noun, it's defined as an act or process through which something becomes different. Its origins in Latin come from the word cambiare, meaning to barter, and in Old French, changer, meaning an exchange or reciprocation. As a process artist and a social practice artist, I love this definition because the driving force behind my work is in its potential to change or inform me in some way while offering a space for others to shape and create a process for themselves if they choose to engage. I also love it because I think that reciprocation is key to any relationship. The idea of change looks different for all of us, as does the process we all go through to get there. So with that in mind, I decided to focus this talk on my own creative process as an artist and activist, and what that looks like sometimes when I'm trying to navigate my way through the questions that most concern me. When I was 22, I reached a point in my life where I felt really torn between a lot of different interests and a lot of different issues that I cared about. And so in order to move forward and not feel paralyzed, I cast this human heart in latex and suspended it in a box with wires pulling it in all these different directions. I did that so I could literally have the experience of stretching it with my own muscle and then be able to observe what that action meant to the human heart-shaped object. I wasn't trying to make art. I was trying to process this moment in my life that I knew had the potential to paralyze me if I didn't find a way to work through it. I know that this is cheesy, and yet the heart with the box in it hangs in my hallway wall to remind me of something. Perhaps to remind me that the way through something for me is by physically constructing a way to figure it out. A year before I stretched out that heart, I was in Kenya as a photographer to document what was being called the orphan crisis in slums and tribal reserves. And I had read a ton of books of everything wrong with the world: genocide, modern-day slavery, globalization, colonization. I didn't know if I'd ever make art again, and when I came back, I had no way of translating that experience, how to capture the sheer beauty of this magnificent Kenyan landscape, of her people, of her culture. Nor did I have any way of describing or sharing these stories of the most extraordinary children I met, who were met with some impossible circumstances. And so after I stretched out that heart, after I felt that same paralysis coming over me again, I went back to the drawing board, or to whatever that is for each of us. And I imagined this space filled with hundreds of empty cradles, because I believed that image could ask a question that I didn't know how to articulate. And that's where the idea of the Cradle Project came to be. I know some people are familiar with that project because there's some people here who made cradles and made that project possible. And that was certainly a journey that we shared and carried together. But for those who are not familiar, I'll just briefly explain. The project was designed to direct our attention to the 48 million children orphaned by disease and poverty in sub-Saharan Africa. Its vision was to collect hundreds of empty cradles made by artists from around the world and display them in a single space against a backdrop of slowly falling sand, believing that hundreds of empty cradles would speak volumes about loss. Over 550 cradles were made by artists from all over and school children, and each one of them carried its own process and relationship and personal story. From the cradles came bones, a deep need to collect them, 1 million of them, and lay them out as a mass grave, pointing our view to the ongoing genocides and mass atrocities happening today. Because how do we reconcile 6 million deaths in Congo, in the systematic rape of women, in the bombing of tribes in Sudan? How will we ever reconcile these deaths in Syria? I have no answers, only questions. And so I imagine these bones, and they were handmade by people, and we carried them onto the National Mall to ask the question, what would it mean for children and adults to hand-make bones and then carry them in the context of considering these conflicts? Because what we carry, what we hold in our hands, that we're responsible for. I did think the US public needed to see a mass grave, and the bones were meant to be both inconvenient and uncomfortable in that way. But the depth of the symbol was in its ability to remind us that we belong to each other, and to ask the question, if in belonging do we find or feel responsibility? It's been almost 3 years since those bones were laid on the mall, and a lot has been moving inside me. And right now I find myself on somewhat of a strange journey, so because those are really difficult to explain, I'm sure you all know, I decided to kind of form it into a story, which I'm going to share with you, and I'll ask you to bear with me, because I'm sure it'll seem odd at times. So it took us over 4 years to collect those bones, and they were heavy. And we knew the place that we were going to carry them to, but I never imagined what I'd do with all that weight. And so during the project, I started to dream of digging, literally, of carving a place in the earth that I could look at and imagine laying them in. And in these dreams, I started to ask this question to myself: does anything go away? It takes 3 years after that first dream of digging to break ground, and I started digging practice for myself. I start to study the meaning of words, and I write the definitions on walls over and over and over again. I'm searching for the right words to ask this question, but they're not there. Words have always failed me. I come across an exhumed child's casket for sale in a shop, and I inquire of its story. It's sad, and it's real. But I've never seen such an honest object, and I'm drawn to it, despite its sadness, despite its weight. And I wonder, because this was an object specifically made to put something away, and I'm so unsettled that the discomfort calls me, and I decide that I'm going to buy it, and I'm going to live with it, because I believe I can learn from it, and because I know that when I can't live with it anymore, I'll bury it, and this makes sense to me. And so as I'm living with it, I pay attention, and every day it changes its meaning to me. And so I decide that I need to weigh it, because that seems the only measurement that I can hold on to when everything else about it is impossible to capture. The casket weighs 25 pounds. And so I take 25 pounds of soil from the hole that I've been digging and sew it into a canvas bag. And I put both of these in a room opposite one another, each on its own table. And there's the scale there. And I consider the space between the casket and the soil. It's a void. I wonder, how could one traverse that space? What would that take? How does one reconsider the means by which they measure the significance of anything for themselves? I understand that this is my road. In my digging and in my studying of words, I realize there's a more important question. And so I leave the former to ask myself this: what does it mean to live with everything that doesn't go away? I dig in a white dress because I need to see what that experience looks like outside of my body, through the residue of dirt and sweat which such an experience demands. And I hang this dress in a room against and with my words, and it teaches me. It shows me that the digging is important, that it is worthy of dressing and showing up for. In my digging and studying of words, I find a response to this question, and I translate that response by authoring a definition to a word I do not believe exists in the language which I know. This is the definition and the space I made to consider it. The relation between the condition of anything being a consequence of the whole of the past. I share this with a few people, but they don't understand. And yet, I believe this definition and this space are of an unexplainable importance, that they point us to a question of whether or not we have a word or frame in language with which to consider the current state of something being a direct consequence of all that came before. I'm driven by this urgency to explain this, so I continue on. I construct a cedar casket that will carry the construct a cedar crate that will carry the casket across the desert, because my digging started in Baltimore and I live in New Mexico. I remember I've been wanting to raise a chicken. I travel to Florida and I get to dig there, where the topsoil is thin and there's sand beneath it. Mixed together, the earth looks like ash, and that's something that remains with me. I stopped digging in dresses. I realize this is work I need to be doing every day and therefore worthy of everyday clothing. So this road is always teaching me. I learned to weld and set out to build an incubator for the chicken which I want to raise, but which I know I will eventually kill and eat. but only after the naming, after the building of the coop, after the appreciation of her eggs, after the living with her, after the loving and caring. This is part of the journey, because the chicken will teach me, and I'll appreciate the chicken always for that. But it's one day at a time, one egg at a time. Presence, consumption, value, labor. I imagine it's all those things in some way. So really it's about building a cost to the relationship. It's about building a relationship to the cost of all the things which I consume every day, but through one, perhaps small, but hopefully meaningful relationship. I then come to this vision that I must sand down to something, that the sanding, like the digging, feels significant. And so I imagine this wall embedded with the impressions of old crutches, a wall that I'll construct and then cover over so that I can sand down to reveal them. Because the sanding is important. Because it's work I also need to be doing every day as a way to get closer, as a way to point me to the impressions of historical trauma which we're all living with and which reside on the surface of our lives, but which my privilege prevents me from actually feeling. So it's about sanding down to reveal the cracks, the fractures in our society which permeate all that is built on top of everything that never went away. After years of looking for just one, I come across a collection of short-handle hoes, all that have been shaped and used over a long period of time. This will be a gift from my husband, whose family used to work hoes like these in the fields as migrant farm workers, where life was hard and unfair. These hoes were eventually banned in parts of this country for their back-breaking design, but only after a long fight. So I construct a box that will hold these hoes and their stories. I then take one of the hoes and then buy a long handle hoe, which I saw the handle off, till it's the same size as the one from the collection. But this one I'll work and shape myself in my digging practice, for as long as it takes for this one to resemble the other. I'm looking to build a relationship with this object, because I believe this relationship could help inform the way that I encounter other objects, and this seems worthwhile. All of these relationships are in pursuit of my question. I seek out conversations to understand this journey and what it means. In one of them, I'm asked another question. If a hole is a void and you fill it, does it go away? I hold on to this and begin another journey, but which I know is connected, because all journeys are connected. And thus begins my exploration into the void. I sit in on college classes about voids, the oceanic void, the void of space, the emotional voids we all hold in our lives. I wonder how we could feel a void. I think that maybe in feeling I could find an answer, but I know there will always be more questions. I have many more conversations, and in some I'm able to see myself, in some I'm misunderstood and misunderstanding. In some I grow more than I could ever imagine, and in some I know my intellect is not worthy, yet I fight anyway. But I struggle. The question nags at me and I need more, because I'm so unsure and I feel it's important, but nothing I've done has explained it. And though I know that all these relationships are about engaging in a process that will allow me to further consider my place and role in this world, I begin to understand that none of them could ever ask, answer, or refine my question to another person while carrying the political gravity which the question deserves. But I'm not ready to leave them. I'm committed to them and to the idea I'm carrying of how they might change or inform me in some way. But this understanding does shift my focus from the question itself to why the question is important. And that feels groundbreaking, like I'm standing on ground zero at the real beginning. Today, this is where I find myself, at the beginning, open, completely open, trying to constantly remind myself that there's a space between everything. And if we consider the space between a question and an answer, how any of us gets from one of those points to the other is really only for them to understand. Perhaps each of us can only have our own truth, and it is up to us, if we are willing, to consider how our truth is related to somebody else's. Maybe that's the everything for me. the realization that there's a cost to everything, that the cost of my ease is directly related to the dis-ease of another, because I'm part of an invisible system that was created far before I was born, but which I inherited and live in the legacy and privilege of. And so I sand and I dig to remind myself that the cost of the American dream included genocide and slavery and a justice system that was built and shaped in an ideology of white supremacy. I dig to remind myself that I live on occupied land, which last year I bought a piece of, and every month I mortgage my relation to that reality, not only in the payment I'm sending in, but in the time I spend earning it. For me, this is what it means to be present in my relationship to and within this world as a white American woman. This month I've been thinking, what does ground zero look like for me in this investigation? Why does this question matter? All this time I've been considering it, I've been focused on the responsibility of what it means to live with everything, all the legacies of trauma to people, to species, and to the earth, but not knowing how to connect that to myself and each of us individually. How do we connect to the whole of the past when it's completely inaccessible, as it's so huge and unrecorded in its entirety? And so I keep asking myself, what if experiences didn't go away? What if instead they changed form through impression and impact and legacy? You see, we'd then have to consider that today we're living with all of them. So what does that mean? What would it mean for us to face ourselves in that reality? This, I believe, is my ground zero. A couple weeks ago, I went to the Grand Canyon on a whim I'd never been. And it just happened to be the big lady's 97th birthday. Well, that's what they were calling it. And I thought that was absurd, but it did get me thinking. Because that canyon was around before time. She was around before we ever thought to measure anything. I'm fascinated by measurements and at the same time deeply disturbed by them, hence the reason for weighing a casket. But all the questions I'm asking do require us to measure something out for ourselves, and I never thought about it that way before, at least not so directly or with words. Perhaps what I've been searching for is a relationship to help me better understand where all these measurements and their consequences have brought us, both individually and collectively, as a community, as a nation, as a planet, as part of an interconnected living system that is moving ever forward. As you can see, I have no resolutions, nor do I hold hope that I'll ever come to any. All I have is a process, and it's one that is constantly being torn down and rebuilt, but that gets refined in each relationship and an awareness of my presence in it. A process to remind me that every relationship matters, no matter how small or seemingly impersonal, because in each of them is an opportunity for us to see ourselves, to face ourselves, to be more present, to offer a space for reciprocation, and in that exchange find ourselves ever questioning, ever sanding, ever digging, ever changing. Thank you.